you. Well, hello there. I didn't think I'd, see you again for like another week. But this is an emergency episode. This is completely live, y'all. So this is Polly Side Eye. Welcome Jared again, or Dr. Jared to y'all.
Call me Jared.
Oh my God, what is going on? I feel like the Monique meme, like, oh my God.
I thought about the Miss Juicy meme when she was like, what the hell we gonna do now?
Oh, yeah. What the hell we gonna do now? Lord. Well, we are completely live, y'all. We can see all of your comments. Hello, I see you. Hello, Terica Carter. Hello. Oh man, where to begin? Like when we premiered the last episode, the whole affirmative action thing like happened. And we were like, oh, we're gonna do another episode later. And then this morning, 2 more things have been struck down. So where to begin? I feel kind of helpless right now, but let's see. If you're not keeping up, basically the Supreme Court in the past 24 hours has struck down affirmative action, like an LGBTQ plus like rights issue, as well as student loan forgiveness. They're on a roll. And then abortion as well. So it's like they're 4-0.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is what Republican or the right, not just Republicans, but mainly Republicans, the right has been doing for the last 40 years, which is kind of building up to a point to where they could have people, conservatives on the court that could do their bidding. And so that's essentially what they're doing now. So we're just seeing that come to fruition.
To me, this is the ramifications of 2016, like Donald Trump appointing, he put 3 judges on the bench, right?
Yeah, he did. Although I'm not one of the like, oh, blame the people who voted for Jill Stein because
the hell I can't.
Or
F y'all ninjas.
I mean, I think that sure that didn't help the situation, but this is something that's been ongoing for a very, very, very long time. There's actually a really good book on this called Democracy in Chains by Nancy McLean that came out in maybe like 2013 or 2014. And she did all of this archival research to show how figures on the right have essentially since like the mid 20th century, since like the 1950s, have been plotting to take over higher education, to take over the media, to take over government, to take over the judiciary. Like this is something that they have been planning for decades. And so things just seem like they're all happening at once now to us because most of us aren't aware of that. But this is what she calls like the stealth plan to essentially roll back democracy. And she takes a very expansive view of democracy, which isn't just voting, but giving people who have to work for a living any power to change their conditions. So this isn't something that's new. And so I think if we only focus on 2016 on, I think we miss how the right has been building all of these institutions for so long to get to this point.
You're right. But I just think we can agree on the fact that I think 2016 just made it worse. And kind of
winning, obviously, what made it, sped things up for sure. But I think if you just focus on that, it's a low-hanging fruit. Like that is maybe one of the catalysts, but that wasn't the cause of it.
Okay. Well, let's do each issue that they struck down in the last 24 hours, because I know you had a lot to say on the last issue, affirmative action. So a lot of people were going crazy about that yesterday. Can you explain like what was at stake here and what did they strike down?
Yeah, so I'll do a quick little history lesson. So affirmative action that we call, what we call affirmative action actually isn't affirmative action as it was originally intended. So affirmative action, well, the terminology arose under the Kennedy administration. So Kennedy released an executive order essentially saying that government agencies had to take affirmative action, which meant they couldn't just be anti-discriminatory, but they actually had to make some type of positive impact on people who have been discriminated in the past, specifically Black people, because keep in mind, this is coming out of Jim Crow and like all the discrimination with like the New Deal and stuff. So affirmative action was originally meant to remedy specific harms that people faced in government agencies, specific harms that Black people face. And these could be easily traced. We had cases where you could easily see that somebody was discriminated against in the workplace. But then when Johnson became president, he issued another executive order, which was even more expansive to include women and I want to say the elderly, but not sexual orientation, but essentially women to have access to the same type of redress. And so the thing that really made affirmative action really complicated, well, two things really, is that Johnson, whenever he gave a speech announcing this, said that the point of affirmative action was to achieve equal opportunity. And so when he said that, people didn't know what to really make of that. Did it mean that you had to have some type of quota? So should like institutions mirror however populations look in the census? So if the country is 60% white, 15% Black, 10% this, that, and the other, should we have institutions that mirror that exactly? Or did it just mean that you had to create some type of programs to help people that are, let's say, in a situation where they don't have the same advantages as others, give them maybe a little bit of a help there, but not necessarily changing the outcome per se. So that whole like equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome was always really murky from the beginning, which anytime there is murkiness, that is a right. Versus equality of outcome was always really murky from the beginning. That was weird. Anytime there's murkiness, that opens the door for legal challenges. So eventually that idea of affirmative action made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And there was one case in 1978, which is very, very decisive, in which this white guy sued the University of California system. The case was the University of California versus Bakke, I believe it was. He sued the University of California. I'm not entirely sure if it was law school or medical school, but he sued them because he didn't get admitted into one of the University of California schools. And he argued that the reason he didn't get admitted is because the university had a quota system. And because of the quota system, there were people who were less qualified than he was, Black people, that were admitted in his place. And so ultimately what that case led to was a rethinking or a reinterpretation of what affirmative action meant. And that reinterpretation was that higher institutions of higher education could use affirmative action only towards the ends of diversity. That was pretty much all they gave us. And it's important to remember that the person who delivered this decision was a conservative. So he's the person who gave us this idea of diversity, which itself was always confusing and opened the door to all types of, again, legal challenges, because anytime there is a blurry spot or a spot where it's not exactly clear what people mean, people can challenge that in the courts. So since then, affirmative action has gone up to the courts repeatedly over the last, let's say, 30 or 40 years. And most recently, there were two cases at Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill in which people essentially tried to, stake their claim again, saying that it's unfair. One was a case with, on behalf of some Asian American students at Harvard, I believe it was. But then at UNC, there was another issue that was raised about race-conscious admissions. And so ultimately what this now conservative court is saying is that in the process of admissions, you can no longer take into account someone's racial status when determining whether or not they are eligible for admission into the university. So that doesn't necessarily mean you can't have diversity programs or diversity initiatives. It just means that in the specific process of admissions, you can't take into account somebody's racial background. Now, how that's going to look in practice is an open question, because now, institutions of higher learning are going to have to devise methods that are within this now new legal precedent, which again is still kind of unclear. And so again, anytime there's uncertainty, you always have conflict.
So to make things clear, like it's not all affirmative action across like the workforce, it's just in.
So this is specifically for higher education, and so colleges and universities. And it's also important to remember that affirmative action in competitive admissions really is kind of limited to a very very narrow strata of universities and colleges, because for most universities, you really don't have the luxury of being selective because you need butts and seats, because you need people paying tuition dollars. And it's a business, or at least it runs like a business. I have issues with running a university as a business, but that's neither here nor there. It's run like a business, which means that for most of these institutions, you just need butts and seats. So, and also many institutions are shedding population, so they definitely don't have the luxury of being that selective. It's really in these places where, and this is why it kind of gets somewhat annoying to me, because the way that the issue is discussed, it makes it seem like it's so widespread, but it's really happening within a very narrow subset of universities. Your Harvard, your Ivy Leagues, your what's called Ivy Pluses, so like your Dukes, Northwesterns, University of Chicago, and maybe some really prestigious state schools. But by and large, like HBCUs, for instance, they're not really that selective, at least not like these institutions are, not because they don't want to be per se, but because they can't afford to be, because you have to have numbers, and most institutions are shedding students anyway. So I think that kind of gets lost in the discussion too.
So we have a question. How do you feel about Justice Clarence Thomas feeling on affirmative action when he graduated from Yale Law School?
So that's an interesting question. There's a really good book about Clarence Thomas if you're interested, where the name of the author is Corey Robin. I can't think of the exact name of the book, but it's trying to tap into Clarence Thomas's ideology. And so what the author argues is that Clarence Thomas believes that the United States is irredeemably racist. And because it's irredeemably racist, any policy that attempts to address racism will necessarily fail. Now, whether or not you think that's a legitimate reason for the opposing programs that would seek to remedy racism is a fair question, but that's kind of his ideology. So for Clarence Thomas, he always felt like these programs stamped him with this idea that he didn't deserve to be where he was. So he's always resented these programs because he thinks that they stamp Black people with this idea that, oh, they need extra help, like they can't do things on their own. And so there's this two-part component where, again, because he believes America is irredeemably racist, he thinks that any government program is going to fail. And this idea that the help itself would be a negative stamp. Now, that argument has so many holes in it. Like, we don't have to sit here and try the point being, that's his ideology. And because that's his ideology, that's how he's going to vote. So like trying to get Clarence Thomas to like reason is like ridiculous. And so I think we should just like accept him for who he is. Y'all can go, whatever y'all want. If calling him Uncle Ruckus or whatever makes y'all feel better, sure. But like at the end of the day, like this is the way that this is his jurisprudence. This has been his jurisprudence his whole life, or his whole legal career. And so I don't really have anything else to say about him.
Yeah, I've accepted him what he is. And I can't say it on here, y'all, or the video might be demonetized. But it's an animal that rummages the trash, and it has black circles around its eyes. Also, what do you say to people that white women have actually benefited off of affirmative action more than Black people?
Well, I think there's pretty compelling evidence that that's the case, but I think it's important to think about why that's the case. So affirmative action really applies, well, again, it originally arose to address government agencies, and Black people were really big beneficiaries of affirmative action, especially in the 60s and 70s, because Black people were disproportionately concentrated in government jobs. And so because Black people were disproportionately located, and that includes like the postal service and things like that. I'm sure most of us have a family member, like my grandfather was a worked at the Postal Service his whole life. It's a great union job. Great benefits, retirement, this, that, and the other. So a lot of Black people got a lot of these good government jobs because of affirmative action. But when affirmative action kind of switched into this diversity thing, as opposed to specifically redressing the harms faced by Black people during Jim Crow and like eras in which there was explicit legal discrimination, that meant that these institutions like universities and things were less focused on these direct acts of harm, and then became more focused on, well, how do we make these boardrooms and how do we get more diversity to the table, essentially. And so because white women are by and large in a much better socioeconomic position than, let's say, the average Black person, male or female, what ends up happening is that white women become the beneficiaries of policies that increasingly become less about working class people, but more about like professional white collar people. And because of the class structure of that, white women became bigger beneficiaries. And so I think part of it is attributed to the history. But then, some of that I'm sure has a lot to do with persistent discrimination. But I would think that most of it has to do with the history.
Okay. This is a question that I definitely was going to ask you. Thank you, Will Lee. I don't know if it was discussed, but do you think packing the Supreme Court would have prevented this from happening?
Maybe. I mean, well, packing it with liberal justices, I'm assuming you mean, not
assuming.
Right. Maybe, but to me, I'm not as concerned about that, because ultimately, and so I'm going to take a little bit of I'm going to step away from that question just a little bit, but it's still relevant. So I think it's important to understand what capitalism really is, because if you do that, then these decisions make a lot more sense. And so I've talked on Poli Sci quite a bit about the basic idea of capitalism and as a historical way of organizing societies is it was meant to give a handful of people. When it first arose, they were men, white, but that's changed. I mean, there are other women in the capitalist, but it was set up for a handful of people not to have to labor to produce the things that they need and want. Instead, they want everybody else to do that, and they want to appropriate that. And so if you understand that, you understand why it is that the Supreme Court, which again, everybody on that court is rich, like it's true. They have a certain idea of how the society should be operated. They believe that there should be people at the top, there should be people who have to work, and the people who have to work should listen and take orders from the people at the top. Like that is their idea of the way that society should be structured. So the reason that the Supreme Court has always been antagonistic towards working people is because they hold this view. This is why the United States has had a very violent labor history throughout its history. This is why after the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s and the anti-war movement, Lewis Powell, the person who gave us the decision about diversity, essentially wrote this scathing memo saying that, people need to be put in their place because people are attacking capitalism. So for the last 50 years, especially, a lot of this is rich, wealthy people being alarmed by the fact that people are trying to attack this basic idea about capitalism. And so if you think about it that way, it makes a lot more sense. And I think this is also a good segue into the next topic, which is the student loan cancellation thing. It makes a lot more sense. And so I think it's important to have that type of class analysis, because otherwise you're just kind of spinning out of control. Like, is this the Handmaid's Tale? Like, what's going on? But there is a very concerted effort here. And the effort being expended is on making sure we have a society that is hierarchically arranged, with a few people at the top and the rest of us taking orders. And that's the extent of it.
Okay. I mean, so it just all leads back to capitalism.
Yeah, but I think it's important to think about capitalism not just as an economic system, but capitalism is what some philosophers call an institutionalized social order. It's the way that we reproduce ourselves. That could be at work, that could be at the university, that could be wherever. It's the way that we all are organized and produce. That's all capitalism. I mean, you can call it whatever you want, but like that's essentially the mode of production. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind, because that is really, for me, and everyone's different. Like some people don't think it's that important. I think it's immensely important, so I always emphasize it. But that's really the motor behind this.
So you got a little challenge in the comments about communism or whatever. They were like, name one good communist country.
We've never had one, so how could you say? But ultimately, the whole going back and forth about the names or whatever, you can call capitalism Sesame Street if you want to, but a system in which a handful of people dictate the terms of everything and we all have to get information, to me, is an unjust one. So to me, like, it shouldn't, the question about communism or socialism or to me, that's all beside the point. The point is, we know that the way that things are currently structured are one in which inequality is not only necessary, but it expands. And one in which racism makes sure that there's always certain people who have to suffer the most. And so to me, like, if you recognize that, you can call it whatever you want, but you should be able to identify that and say, oh, wow, something seems kind of crazy about this. This seems kind of psychotic. I don't know. But, I'm just one person. Like, and so if you think that that's okay, or that's, then so be it. But I don't. So
let's go to like another topic, because I know we could be on affirmative action for a while. I only got like 25 minutes, y'all. So let's get to student loan and forgiveness, how that was just struck down. That was like the fourth, I'm about to say like quadruple whammy, I guess. Like, what do you think about that?
So to reply to disagreement, whose name Soviet Union, Cuba's yes, they have called themselves communists, and in many ways they've tried to strive towards that, but they've often had to deal with the West, specifically the United States, embargoing them, attacking them at every turn. And so, like, even as they're trying to create a more equitable society, the rug is being pulled from under them under every scenario. I'm not trying to say communism is a silver bullet. What I'm saying is that you can call it whatever you want. We should all be striving for a more equitable society, like, irrespective of whatever we call it. So I just want to say that. But what was your question again?
Yeah, about student loan forgiveness, how that was down.
Yeah, so I actually wrote about a year ago, maybe longer, saying that there was a few reasons why I didn't think that the student loan thing was going to be uphill. One is because it strikes way too close to the core of meritocracy. So meritocracy is essentially the idea that if you work hard, you can achieve it. Like, nothing stopping you, lift yourself up from your bootstraps, all that tomfoolery. So that idea is so dominant in American society that I thought that canceling student debt would call that idea into question in a way that people in power couldn't accept. Because part of the way that people in power are able to stay in power is by creating and circulating these ideologies that lead people to believe that if you work hard, you can achieve. And if you don't achieve, it's because you didn't work hard. You can't implicate the policies. You definitely can't implicate capitalism. So it's a good way to, like, legitimate the inequalities. And so I didn't expect for it to be upheld for that reason. Now, another thing to consider or to remember is that debt itself, we've kind of talked about this in other episodes, but debt is ultimately a relationship. Like, you can call it what it want, but if there's debt, there's a debtor and there's a creditor. So that means that if you have a loan for a certain amount of, you have $15,000 in credit card, that is, you are paying that to somebody. Like, you're not paying that to Chase, because Chase isn't a thing. It's like, you can't touch Chase. Chase is just a collection of individuals who, because of legal customs and rules, are allowed to form different types of arrangements that make them call themselves a corporation. But corporations aren't real things. Like, you can't touch Walmart, you can't touch Wells Fargo. So you're paying off your credit card, that you're paying that to somebody. If you have debt, that what is that? How do you pay that debt off? Oh, you have to get a job. So debt is always an easy way to secure what I've already said is the most important component of capitalism, which is people who can work for other people. And so debt has always been considered a form of peonage or slavery. In fact, back in the 19th century, people would say that the only difference between chattel slavery and wage slavery is that one is permanent and one is at times temporary, but ultimately, like, you're still enslaved. And so that is just another mechanism to keep the status quo intact and to make sure that that you have a group of people who can labor for the people at the very top. So that's my reading of it. And so as long as that ideology isn't called into question, I didn't imagine why the Supreme Court, this conservative reactionary Supreme Court at that, was going to strike that down. I mean, was going to uphold that.
It's quite the toxic relationship. And even though, like, I literally just paid off my student loans, just with other people like going through it. I know you don't know who Tasha K is, but I know the theme for that is like, I ain't got it. They ain't gonna get it anyway. So I guess.
And I mean, it's not like again, this is why it's not a question about like policy or like what can be done, because we see what happens when Silicon Valley Bank goes under. The Treasury and the Federal Reserve steps in, prints like $1 bazillion, and like, okay, good, nothing to see here, move on. But we have a student debt crisis, which has turned into a bubble where now I think the outstanding debt is somewhere like 1.3 or 1.4 trillion dollars. So why is it that Silicon Valley Bank is too big can be bailed out? Why is it that JP Morgan Chase, which again, JP Morgan Chase is not a real thing, it's just a collection of individuals, why do they get bailed out, but students who were forced to take out, in many cases, these loans because higher education has been systematically defunded or underfunded for so long? So most of these institutions don't even have the resources to offer, unless you're at a very prestigious university. Most universities don't have the types of finances to offer people scholarships and other forms of financial aid aside from loans. And so why should working people be on the hook for that behind these policies that they had no hand in crafting? It's I mean, if somebody can explain it to me, I would love to hear it. Or what Monique said, I would like to see it.
Like, it's not fair. Like, you see all these bailouts for different like companies, but once like the people need a bailout, and it's just like, no, y'all broke ass better find a job and figure it out.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what they want. Like, you can't have a capitalist society without people who have to work. And so like the Supreme Court and again the economic and the political elites at the very top, pretty much everybody who reads the Wall Street Journal or writes for the Wall Street Journal, that's the people I'm talking about. So if you go to the Wall Street Journal, every op-ed they have, they're like they're like jumping up and down that student loan debt wasn't canceled, because they're just like, get y'all broke asses to work, stop complaining. So they love it. And so I always tell people, if you really, really want to know what the very wealthy in the United States are thinking, read the Wall Street Journal, because they're very open about it. They talk about how they hate remote work. They talk about how they hate government programs. They talk about how much they hate affirmative action. They talk about how much they hate all these things, like diversity. Like, they're very, very open about it. So I just use that as a proxy to get a sense of where the rich people are, because again, they're very, very open, because they're just talking to each other.
Where the rich people are. Good book. How much is the Wall Street Journal, if anybody wants to like subscribe to it or just thinking about it?
Oh God, I don't know. I mean, fortunately, because I work at the university, I get free access. If I had to guess, a daily monthly subscription is probably like $20, $15. If I had to guess, but I don't know that for sure. I'm just spitballing.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, let's get to the next thing that was affected. And on Pride Month, well, the last day, it just felt like, when we were walking down like somewhere in Manhattan and we passed the Zara, and it was just snatching down those rainbow flags and all types of advertisements. This kind of feels like it with the like something that happened with gay rights. What happened with that?
So this just happened earlier today, I think. So I haven't gotten a chance to like look too deeply into this. But from my understanding, there was some type of like graphic designer. I don't remember.
Yeah.
They were. I don't remember I don't want to make up something, but a graphic designer essentially brought this case saying that she or they. I don't remember their gender or if they even had the whatever. I don't remember all of the details about the person, but the essence of the case was that they didn't having to print some type of flyer or graphics for a homosexual couple would be impinging on their freedom of religion, essentially. And so they won the case saying that they don't have to print for, yeah, exactly. But they don't have to design websites for gay people because it impinges on their religious freedom. So it's another one of those like Christian right cases. So part of what's going on here is that the Christian right and the business right. So you have to think about who comprises the right in the United States. I'm not talking about like working people. I'm talking mainly about like the people who lead the institute. It's mainly these Christian fundamentalists probably run a lot of these big mega churches and that type of evangelical side. It's also like these hyper conservative business people, mainly from like energy and oil. They tend to be much more conservative, or at least more right wing than other CEOs and things. So there's like this marriage between this side of the business class and the religious fundamentalists that has existed since really the mid 20th century. So we talked about this in another episode before. The reason that under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and the reason that in God we trust was added to our currency was because of this marriage between the religious fundamentalists or the evangelicals and the business class. And the idea being that, well, the Republican Party can't really win based on its actual policies, which their policies are, in a nutshell, cut taxes for the very wealthy, make sure that cut social programs so you can make sure that you have enough people working for you, and build up jails just in case things get too crazy, and then throw people in it, Black people mainly, but that's kind of the essence of their program. But you can't win elections that way, so you have to like pivot to something else. And what they did was they pivoted to the Christian stuff, so like appealing to more moral issues, so called. And so part of it is a very cynical strategy to solidify that base. And there is a very strong evangelical base that politicians can take this decision to them and be like, hey, like we're still like out here fighting for y'all, when in fact they're just like, raising taxes on everybody except like the top one.
Yeah, it just felt like they were legalizing discrimination.
Well, the court is going to say it's not discrimination because you can go somewhere else. Like you don't have to go to this vendor.
I still don't think that's fair. They should go out.
But what did I say earlier? Anytime there's room for gray area, you're going to have legal battles. Like that's how the courts work. All they do is litigate these uncertainties or these like gray areas. That's all that they do. It's all about interpretation, and your interpretation of things is going to vary depending on what your class position, how your view of the world is. And their view of the world is they're being like the right. Their view of the world is America is the greatest place the world has ever seen. All these people in the streets saying that racism is built in the DNA, into the fabric and all that. They need to be put in their place because they don't know how good they have it, and they just shut up and understand that they live in the greatest country in the world. We're not going to take people saying these bad things about this country. That's essentially their view of the world. And so if that's your view of the world, your interpretation of this isn't discriminatory is going to look much different than somebody who has to work for a living and has probably experienced some form of discrimination on a pretty constant basis.
Mm-hmm. And all of these decisions were made, like, I'm guessing it was just 6-3.
Well, these like hot button issues. Yeah. It's also important to remember the Supreme Court actually agrees on more things than they disagree about. But it's usually these very like hot button issues that get the most coverage because they sell better. So like nobody wants to hear a case that was taken up about like some like arcane tax code that actually probably has more direct ramifications for your day-to-day life than do a lot of these other cases. But these are the things that are going to get on the cover of the New York Times and on MSNBC and circulated on Twitter because nobody wants to hear about a case that's about some regulation passed 30 years ago. Again, that probably is affecting you more than a lot of these other issues, but are not as entertaining.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question that was presented earlier. Do you feel that the choice of Supreme Court justices should be at the hands of the people?
I mean, I don't think the Supreme Court should exist. So hopefully, I hope that don't get you demonetized. I don't think the Supreme Court should exist. So I definitely, if that can't happen, then I feel like the next best thing would be for them to be, democratically accountable, because they're not democratically accountable. They can do, once they take that oath, they can do whatever they want. I mean, unless there's like some treasonous activity, but even what's considered treason is open to interpretation. I think almost everything they do is treasonous, so you can't ask me, but I'm not the one, who believes in these institutions. So I'm probably not the best person to ask.
Right. Abolish capitalism, abolish the Supreme Court, abolish prisons. Like,
I just think we need to think a little bit more critically or deeply about the type of world we want. Like what does justice look like to us? That seems like a very like Sesame Street question, but unless you have a vision of what you think a just world looks like, it's really hard to do anything about anything. Like that needs to be one of the first things. We have to have a vision of like what justice in a fair world looks like.
Mm-hmm. So y'all, if you're just entering the room, we are live. We have 87 people in here. While Jared is here and while I'm on for the next maybe 10 minutes, you can ask a question. You can be a part of the show. I'm not going to put you on the show, but you can, ask a question. And also keep it cute, or you will be put on mute. Let's see. Yeah. Abolish student loans. Yeah, I agree with that.
So there's actually a history. Do people know why we have student loans in the first place? So up until like the late 1960s, higher education was pretty dirt cheap. Like most people could pay for all of their education with like a part-time job at like a grocery store. Like it was dirt cheap. And so there's a multitude of reasons why, but like one reason why the financing your education was adopted as a new policy is because, again, debt serves as a tool of control. And so people on the right were really fearful of the fact that people were contesting the United States. You had Black people who were contesting the racial injustices. You had women who were contesting the gender injustices. You had young people who were contesting the war machine during Vietnam. You had environmentalists who were contesting how automobiles were killing people. Remember, automobiles didn't have seatbelts until seatbelts weren't legally required until I think like the late 70s, early 80s. And that was a huge issue because cars were like, we really only, adding seatbelts isn't financially, it only will drop the number of people who die in a wreck from like this number to that one. But that was a whole big thing. And so part of what the financing of education sought to do was to get people away from learning the types of things that would help them to understand the world that they lived in and then begin to challenge it. So towards like business majors or like finance or like marketing or things that ultimately kept the capitalist machine going. Because if you take philosophy or you take history or sociology, you start to see things in a different way. And if you're in power, you can't have that. You can't have people thinking that the current system is a mess. And if you think I'm just being, tinfoil hat, there's a really good memo I would recommend everyone read. It came out in 1971. It was a memo that Lewis Powell, who was later appointed to the Supreme Court by President Nixon, released to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, called The Attack on the Free Enterprise System. And in this memo, it's all publicly available. It leaked in like the late 70s, early 80s, I want to say, but it's all publicly available. In that memo, he outlines all the things that capitalists needed to do to essentially suppress any type of opposition towards it. So they needed to take over the academy, take over the news media, take over government, take over all these other things. And so they delineate a clear plan to do that. And so part of that idea was that if you make people have to pay for their education or even take out loans to go to school, you're not going to major in philosophy because you're not going to get an effing job. So you're going to go major in marketing or accounting or finance or law or something else that, you know, I mean, there's nothing wrong with those fields, but the types of jobs you get from those degrees are jobs that only fortify the capitalist system. And so this was all very intentional. Like we didn't just stumble into it.
Mm-hmm. You have another question. How do you guys feel about lifetime appointments? I mean, of course, I'm against that, but I'm pretty sure you have a more.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think the Supreme Court should exist. So, I mean, since we do have a Supreme Court, would I be in favor of lifetime appointments? I mean, or getting rid. Sure. I mean, some people will say that the lifetime appointments, or if you have like terms, then they're going to be much more beholden to like moneyed interest, because especially if they got reelected, because then they just kind of act like politicians, which politicians, all they care about is getting reelected. So all they do is respond to their donors essentially. So the idea is being like, oh, well, once they have lifetime appointments, they don't necessarily have to respond to their donors, because if they don't, like, it's not like you can hold them to account. Whereas if you are having to go up for reelection, if you don't respond to your donors would fund somebody else who would. So I can kind of see both sides of it. I don't have a strong enough opinion one way or the other, though.
Mm-hmm. Well, my question is, like, what can we do at this point? Because you just feel kind of powerless, and then you feel cynical about politics. And I know, like, of course, not just voting for president is enough. I feel like maybe not even voting all the time is enough, but, you know, we should vote. But, like, what is there to do?
Yeah, I mean, electoral politics is one lever that you can pull. I wouldn't even say it's the primary one. So if we look to history, the only time there's been, well, I guess it depends. What are we trying to do? Are we actually trying to battle like economic inequality? Like I guess it depends. What is the aim? What is the goal? Like what are we striving for? That's why I'm saying I think it's important to have a vision of where you're trying to go, because that can inform like what you do. But if you don't know where you're trying to go, then it's kind of hard to like have a program about like.
I guess making sure that we're not undoing progress, like, because it just looks like the conservative agenda is to just undo like a lot of things that help people that aren't white, rich, and male.
Again, I think it depends on what. I mean, are we just talking about like? That's the thing. Like a lot of the things they're doing, it's not like things that you can like a lot of the cases they take up are issues that are very like, they're not concrete. Like they're not things that you can directly address. I'm sure like you can maybe pass another law and pass another legislate. Yeah, like those are viable things to do, but to me, like I think we should think a little bit bigger than that. So like what is the root of what? It depends what you think the root of the issue is. Why do we think that they're doing this?
Like what is the bigger picture? What is the plan?
Yeah, like why would 6 people in the Supreme Court vote for that? Like what is their motivation? I mean, think about like in a Marvel movie. The only way you beat the villain is to know what's motivating them, so you can get in their head, so you can kind of be one step ahead of them. That's the whole idea. How you beat the villain is to kind of have a sense of like where their head is, what their motivations are, so you can kind of be strategic about like, oh well, if I think that's where they're trying to go, let me try to intercept them here. But if you don't know what the motivation is, it's kind of hard to do that, which is why I'm saying I think it's important to remember why capitalism exists as a system. It exists so that a handful of people essentially cannot have to work and can depend on what 98% of the population produces, so that both what they need and what they want to live. Like that is essentially the essence of it. So like the thing that they hate most is when you try to address, or you try to do anything that upends that. So the reason they hate the welfare state is because having government programs that help people means that you don't have people who are as dependent on a wage to survive. Now, they know that if most people heard that, they probably wouldn't have an issue with it. So what do? They come up with welfare queens and all this other ridiculousness to make people have a different interpretation of who is benefiting from what. But the welfare state isn't just for poor people. Middle class people get all type, the mortgage interest deduction. If you buy a house, like the entrance, you can get that. There's the earning. There's all types of social programs that not just poor people benefit from. And in fact, the people who benefit the most from social programs are rich people, because they're the ones who always get the biggest tax write-offs, like the low tax on capital gains and all that other stuff. And so once you understand like what it is that they want, or the type of society they want, it becomes a lot easier to like strategize. So the reason that people at the very top always hate unions is because unions have historically been one way, or one primary mechanism that inequality has been attacked. Now, unions aren't perfect. Like, we know that there's been history of racism and gender discrimination, all kind of other things within labor unions. We also know that a lot of undocumented immigrants aren't represented by labor unions. So it has all types of issues. But I think that ultimately you have to have institutions large enough that can push back against the institutions that rich people put together to defend their interests. So like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and things like that, where they're organized, they know exactly all these think tanks and things, they know exactly where they're trying to go, and they write policies to like enshrine their position. So I think we have to do similar things. Like, I think the only way that you can combat that is with other institutions. You also have to be knowledgeable of things. So I think it also helps. I mean, not to like plug our show, but I feel like we should be having more conversations like this, like on a daily basis. This shouldn't be one-off. Like, why don't they have shows like this on NBC? Like, why don't they, and Meet the Press and all that shit doesn't count. Why don't they have shows like this on, on TikTok? Like, why is it that you have to seek out these things? Why aren't these things that are readily available to people, where people can, if their minds aren't necessarily changed, can at least hear things that are like, I never thought about it that way. Oh, wow. Like, that's really interesting. Like, so I think we need more of that too. So I think those are two things that we could do. Start thinking about how we can create these institutions that can hopefully grow as we learn more people who understand the world and in similar ways. And also like platforms where we can have critical conversations, and not just what you see on CNN, where people are just yelling at each other for like 2 minutes about nothing.
Yes. I do think there aren't shows like this because like these media networks are owned by rich people, or like
the cloud consciousness.
I mean, look, I'm around you enough. And then like, even if there are shows, like who's going to sponsor the show? Like, they need sponsors, they need money. So that's another thing. So I get it. I get it. Like, thinking outside of the box. This is our last question, y'all, because a ninja got to eat and go. What do you think the courts in this country will look like in 10 to 20 years if the GOP didn't hijack the last two appointments?
I definitely think we probably would be in a slightly better position, but only slightly, because the legal situation is only one leg of it. Like, you still have the economic component. We just did an episode yesterday about the Airbnb bubble and all of that. So the legal aspect would have I mean, I guess it might have something to do with that, because part of the way that arose was also because of the way that some of our laws and regulations are written. But it's important, again, to remember that, like I said before, the Supreme Court actually agrees on far more things than they disagree on. Like, I want to say, like, for most Supreme Court terms, like they agree on like 90% of the things that come before them. And most of the times it's stuff like tax things or regulatory things or again, some deep arcane law that was passed in some state but oftentimes, like most of these laws that they are in agreement about are ones that benefit business owners, investors. And so we've erected the legal system again has been erected specifically to protect private property. And so I think it's important to remember that. And again, The Framers' Coup is the book I recommended about this because I think it helps to understand how the legal system operates and what the function of it is. And so I don't think looking to the legal system for we've gotten things out of the legal system, but I think the fact that winning things through the courts is so noteworthy to me just goes to show that it's the exception to the rule. Like most of the times the courts are going to rule on behalf of moneyed interests investors for the most part. So I don't know if I think it would be that much better. Probably still better.
Mm-hmm. Oh man. Well, I got my learning for today. Thank you for having this conversation with me and explaining a lot of things because I learn something every day I do poli-sci eyes. So yeah. Thank y'all for joining us. Jared, his handle is JC Tiger Fan, JayCTigerFan. I'm a little delusional because I am running on fumes right now.
Couldn't even tell.
Oh, look. What else is there? I'm just pretty sure once we log off, something else is going to happen. But I'm glad we had 2 of these in a week.
Yeah, well, it won't be a Supreme Court thing because the student debt thing, I think it was the last case they rendered. So they won't be back until this time next year to ruin our lives.
Yeah, like they have a break during the summer, right?
Yeah, they're done. So this was the last decision.
Whew. And I didn't say the F-bomb this entire episode, but fuck the Supreme Court right now. That's just on me, okay? I don't know how you feel, but fuck them as a collective.
I mean, I don't think they should exist. So, like, that's fine with me.
Yeah. But yeah, y'all, make sure y'all like, comment, and subscribe. And make sure y'all share this video too. I will be back to my pop culture and housewife shit later this week.
I will not be here, so sorry, y'all.
Yeah. Can you name a housewife aside from Nene Leakes?
Candy.
And Candy too. Like, name a white housewife.
Wasn't Lisa Vanderpump a housewife at one point?
Okay. All right. Fine.
Hey.
You know something. We will not be here for my housewife shit. Anyway, look out for Pop Roast 2. I think that's going to be live tomorrow. I'm so tired. Anyway, y'all, I will see y'all soon. Thanks, Jared.
Bye.
Bye.